Okay, thank you very much. And thank Jen for the really, really very sweet introduction. And I have to say straight up, okay, Jen Yu is about one of the best things that ever happened to me, okay, in terms of research. Kind of taking this old lady right up to the front end, okay? So, all right, so to begin, learning depends on both the learning machinery and the learning experiences. And optimal learning really requires that the computations of the machinery align with the statistical properties of experience. In biological organisms, and particularly for species important learning, the learning machinery and the learning experience are not independent. Okay? Evolution has sculpted learning mechanisms to match the statistics of the experience and has sculpted the statistics of experience through the behaviors of the learner and the social partners who play a role in generating the data for learning to match the learning machinery. For these reasons, I think studying the statistics of everyday learning experiences is the path to a deeper understanding of the underlying mechanisms. Now, I want to expand on this a little bit. So at each moment in time, this is a figure from a paper I wrote with Olaf Sporns and Lisa Burge, who are really interested in functional and structural connectivity and how it changes with development and varies as a function of task. At each moment in time, the developing infant plays a role in creating experiences for learning through their own behavior. Do they smile at the parent? Do they bounce a ball? Do they bang an oatmeal box? Their generation of that behavior at each moment in time depends on the activation and the network patterns in the brain that were shaped through evolutionary processes, sculpted by development, and shaped in the moment by what was just happening in the just preceding moment, and by the immediate input. And this, of course, also elicits their own moves forward. Their own behavior in time is related to where they just were and the state of the brain and what happened. It also elicits reactions from parents. If you smile, does a dad move in? Does he smile? If they're banging on the box, does somebody speak to them about playing a drum? This dependency, I think, between the learning mechanisms, the statistics of the input, and the behaviors of the learner, as well as their social partners, I think has fundamental implications for how we think about explaining intelligence, how it develops in biological forms, and for autonomous machine learning. So that's what I want to talk about. So here's today's talk. I'm first going to talk about the loop between the internal state, the behavior of the learner, and the data for learning. Then I'm going to talk about how learning mechanisms are likely optimized with respect to the natural structure of the world and its statistics. And third, I'm going to talk about how these interdependencies between internal state behavior and the world actually get emphasized, exaggerated by the joint behaviors of two brains, say parent and infant, with similar intrinsic dynamics. Okay. All right. So as many of you know, and as Chen mentioned, we have been working on trying to capture the input for learning for a long time now. And there are four kinds of data sets that have worked on. One is what we call the multisensory data, which is high resolution. Everybody's wired up, head cameras, motion sensors, hands and heads, multiple cameras in the room. It's high resolution, but it's naturalistic in the sense that it is free flowing. But maybe going a little more natural, we also have data from what we call the toy room context. This is now free flowing, cluttered in the lab. And whereas in multisensory, we use head-mounted eye trackers regularly, in the toy room, we can use head-mounted eye trackers or just head cameras. Then there are two data sets which are actually going to play the core of most of what I talk about today. And those are the ones where we try to record day-long or multiple day head cameras in children's homes with no experimenters present. And we have between HomeView and IndiaView data on about 160 children from 1 month to 24 months of age, where they wore head cameras in the home across whole days and several days, doing whatever babies do, okay, with no instructions, okay. All right. But today, from all these various data sources, to make the points that I want to make, I'm going to select studies where we're really focused on learning about object categories and object names, okay, and with 9 to 18-month-old infants. So the loop between the internal state, behavior, and the data for learning. Oops. All right. So the first study I'm going to talk about is a kind of older one. And this was one in the multisensory project where we brought parents and infants into the lab and we had them play with novel toys that we gave names to. We invented the toys and we invented the names. The parents were taught and reminded about the names before the play session. So parents and infants played with the toys, and then at the end, we tested the infants on their learning of those object names. Okay. And what we did this actually twice in two slightly different ways, was what we did in both of those studies. Why am I having trouble moving my slide forward? There we go. In both of those studies, was we asked how the naming moments associated with the learned names, what the properties of the visual experiences were during those naming moments. So for each child, we designated each object as having learned the name or not learned the name by the level of performance. And then we went back in, and for each of the naming moments for those objects, we looked at what were the visual properties during the moments it was named. Okay. And what I show here is a slide that represents those visual properties. So let me explain this because it looks kind of complicated. At the bottom here, the sort of blurred thing at the bottom, the little middle thing here is when the parent named the object, and then we looked at the visual properties for 10 seconds after and for 10 seconds prior to that naming event. And we looked at the visual properties for the named object. Let's say this was the one that was named, the big green thing here, and for the competitors on the table. We did that two ways, looking at the mean properties of the competitors and also at the individual competitors. This is the mean property of the competitors here. And two of the measures that are particularly interesting, I think, are the visual size of the object in the image, much larger here than here, let's say, and the overlap of the object with the center of the head-centered frame of reference, that is the head camera image. And what you can see is when infants learn the object name, the named object was much bigger in the visual field than the competitors. And that was not true. The difference was much, much less when they did not learn the object name. And that when they learned object names, the named object was on average much closer to the center and therefore more distant from other objects in the infant visual field than when they did not learn the name. The other thing that is of interest is that the time span of these advantages were long, beginning before the name and lasting after. This is actually over about almost 7 seconds that it's a reliable difference from before to after, okay? The big point that I want to make from these older studies is that these findings are a direct consequence of the toddler's body and how their sensory motor systems work and how they interact with the world. And we have lots and lots and lots of data on this, and I just want to go through pretty rapidly, okay? Babies, this is the size of objects, is a new study with Andre Mendez and Chen that we're about ready to submit, but this is the relative visual size of an object in the child's field of view. This is the moment gaze is directed to that object, and the moment gaze stops being directed to that object. And what you can see is that the visual size increases, okay, for an attended to object when gaze goes to it. And that's because principally they lean in, they move their heads closer. They don't look just moving their eyes, they look with their whole bodies, they lean in, okay? We also know that they're more likely to learn the object name if the head is stable. These are successful versus unsuccessful learning. We know that they're more likely to earn the object name when the child holds the object than when the parent holds the object. This we have good reason to believe, although we have good reason to believe, I'll just say that, is due to because when the child holds the object, the head is stabilized longer. Okay. When the child holds the object, gaze is more centered in the head-centered frame of reference and stabilized within it. Okay. So child holding leads to learning. In some newer work that I'm doing now, I'm looking at what holding does to the low-level visual properties of the input. And what it does, okay, is it puts high contrast at the center of the head-centered frame of reference, okay? So this is the median contrast at each pixel, 3-degree windows, over 60,000 images of holding, okay? High contrast in the center, greater visibility. These babies are using their bodies to make really good visual information for learning about objects. Okay. So the point that I want to make here is that the loop between the internal state, baby's looking at something, wants to look at it, their behavior, leaning in, holding it close, biases the data for learning and actually optimizes, I think, visibility and other properties like a stabilized head and gaze that support learning. And this is through their body, okay? But when babies are looking at objects and holding them, they present biased information in other ways. By holding, looking, moving objects, they generate changing views. Active vision like this is not like looking at a picture at all, okay? And so in a series of studies I've done with Karen James, we have looked at the kinds of images that babies present to themselves when they are holding objects. And what we're doing here is we match the views babies show themselves to all the possible views in a sphere around the object. And what you see is those views are biased. It's really clear in the 2-year-olds. This part of the viewing sphere, what we've done is taken the sphere and flattened it, just like a map of the globe, and then you flatten it, okay? These are views here where the object is held upright, what we would call top and bottom. They're biased to that, and they are biased to views that are what are called in the field planar views. These are views in which the major axis is perpendicular or parallel to the line of sight. Perpendicular here, parallel, and the major axis is defined as the longest axis of the object or the axis of greater symmetry, and they usually align those two properties. So these are hotspots around the planar views, okay? Now, when you look at 1-year-olds, they are much more problematic, okay? They're a little bit all over the place. They don't care about upside down and upside right, but they have nascent hotspots that are reliable for those same planar views. What this smear is across these planar views, that is the rotation of the major axis in depth, okay, which many people believe who have studied vision for a long time reveals the non-accidental properties of objects that enable you to structure the shape, okay? Now, one of the ideas we had early was that these biases might be due to how we hold hands. Maybe it's holding that creates these biases. You know, you can hold an object when you're a little guy with two hands and you rotate it like that. But it's not about holding. In fact, holding gets in the way. This is a visual bias. We know this because we put the objects in spheres, which are see-through plexiglass spheres, which are now equipotential, okay, to the to all possible views. And actually the bias for young children gets stronger when you put them in spheres. The hands are getting in the way. And we're now working on a study, although we stopped it for COVID, so Lord knows when it happens again, where we're looking at 6-month-olds. And I believe the results are going to show that 6-month-olds prefer the same views, that it's actually a visual bias, okay, to prefer these kinds of views. So we'll see where that takes us, but that's the thought, okay. All right, so, oops. All right, so the input is biased and it's connected to biases within the system, probably reflecting evolutionary, developmental, the kid's own behavior and interest, motor development. Okay. And the next thing I want to suggest is that the learning mechanisms are optimized with respect to the natural structure of the environment, okay? And this is where I'm going to go to the HomeView data, and the findings are kind of new, and some of them, and so I'm on the early end of talking about them, but I'm really interested in what you all think. So from the HomeView corpus, what I'm going to do is talk about data that was pulled from one context. You have to look at a context because everything in the massive data of the real world is sparse. If you're going to aggregate over anything, you have to pick a context because the objects you see, the words you hear, what you do are all context dependent. Being at mealtime is not like bedtime, is not like in the park. Okay, so we selected mealtime for these studies, and the reason why is that children this age eat 5 times a day. We define mealtime as food being eaten anywhere, okay? So don't just think sitting at a table, you could be on the floor, you could be in the car. And we collected these meal times over multiple days, and the infants are just under 1 year of age. And the reason we chose infants under 1 year of age is because of now quite replicated work suggesting that children have reliably acquired a fair number of object names receptively prior to their first birthday. And we know this because what happens is in the experiment is somebody says a word like cup, and the babies will look reliably to a picture of the cup on the screen, okay? So, and this has now been replicated. Bergelson and Swingley were among the first, but it's now been replicated by a number of different labs. So what we want to know is what are the statistics for early word learning in the natural environment of these babies? And we chose the mealtime context, and we look at 40 categories, all of which are normatively early learned names. So how do we do this? Okay. So from these 87 mealtimes, we took every category that was on the MCDI that showed up at least once, okay? These right here, all the objects in view that showed up at least once, okay? These are all the words, nouns, that got said at least once, okay? And then we independently selected the top 25 objects that were present at meal times across these 87 meal times in different children, because those are objects that maybe are available enough at meal times to get learned, object names. And then we selected independently the object names that were most frequent, okay, across those 25 meal times, across those 87 meal times, okay. So we're independently, we decided we'll look at the most frequent reference and we'll look at the most frequent words, okay? Interestingly, they're not the same, okay? And there is no correlation in frequency between the objects present and the names heard. There are some that overlap in the middle, okay? So many of the visually frequent categories are background things, some food items. Many of the lexically most frequent items are food names, although many of these foods are not really, like pizza is just entering the lives of 1-year-olds, okay? And it's not particularly common food for a 1-year-old. And some of them, a few words were both named and present, okay? All right. So what do we want to do? For these 40 categories, we asked, how often are visual instances of those categories, these are frequent, okay? How often are they in the infant field of view? And we asked, how often are they named? And what are their statistics of their co-occurrence, okay? And we did this at 2 time scales, okay? Time separated experiences across meal times, like how many meal times does a cup show up, okay? So day in, day out, multiple meal times, how often does a cup show up? But we also asked about the statistics of the experiences within individual meal times. So given you've got a visual cup in your mealtime, how long is it lasting? Is it likely to be named? So forth, okay? And again, I'm going to give you just highlights of these results, the most important. So the first results are about the time scales across meal times. The top is shown the histogram of the proportion of the 87 meal times in which these objects were in view at all. And we use very liberal. If it was there, even for a bit, we call it there, okay? And so those are the histograms, all ordered by the frequency of the visual information for the proportion of meal times in which the referent was visually available, for the portion of meal times in which the referent was visually named, and for the proportion of meal times in which the referent was viewed and named, okay? And because these are all right skewed and you're trying to ask what's the sort of optimal stuff for learning, and there's other contexts where things could be learned, we also did all our analyses over all the categories, just summing across all this up here, just looking at the top 10 most visually frequent and the top 10 most frequently named, okay, to sort of be fair to these kind of odd distributions. By these measures, there's just one basic conclusion. Visual reference are frequent. Naming is very rare. And that means that name object co-occurrences are rare, okay? Because the names just don't occur. They are, like all content words in produced language, sparse, sparse, sparse. And this is a known effect, okay? In fact, most people who do work on early word learning, when they show that name object co-occurrences predict later vocabulary, they don't look at name object co-occurrences for particular words. They look at every name object co-occurrence that they can measure in an hour of parent talk to kids, even if each name occurred once, and they predict vocabulary for other words, vocabulary in general. But the data for individual words, to learn banana, the kid has got to hear banana, okay? And naming is sparse, 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 okay? These are the time scale within a mealtime. And now here I'm just presenting to you when the name was present, okay? So given that they said a name, how many minutes was the object in view, okay? So I'm just within mealtime. Each dot is an individual mealtime. So given that the name was said at all, how likely was, what portion of the mealtime, how long was the object in view in the mealtime? And as you can say, there are, you know, these are 10 minutes, mealtimes are roughly about 10 minutes. And, you know, the objects in view a pretty decent amount of time. Sometimes in view the whole, 40 minutes. One child had a very long mealtime. And So then you can say when the name is present, okay, was the, how many naming instances were there per mealtime? Here, pretty decent, 5, some much more, but 5 times in the mealtime it was named, okay? And so, and these, the results actually within a mealtime look plausible. Do you know what I mean? That there are, 5 minutes of naming and 10 minutes of the object being visually present, 5 times naming, 10 minutes of the object. But can a 1-year-old learn from that individual little, could a 1-year-old literally learn from 10 minutes of object viewing and 5 naming events? My instincts, given the literature and my own failed experiments, okay, as well as other people's, is probably no. And even if they showed that they could, when tested immediately after, 2 days later, it would be gone, okay? There's no evidence that I know of that babies under a year of age can form durable and expressible memories from just one few minute experience with multiple naming. Okay. This figure puts the 2 time scales together. What we did was simulate what 200 meal times would look like. We did it for each individual category of the 40, but here I'm showing you the 4 individual categories. Since infants eat 4 to 5 times a day, 200 meal times is roughly 2 months of input, okay? And I have the triangles at the top. So the blue is the object was visually present in this mealtime. The yellow was the name was present. And the green is that they're both present. Notice how sparse the green is. Yellow is very sparse too. Names don't occur without the object visual present. But here's what, if these statistics are right in general, here's what the input repeated over multiple encounters is like. You get a lot of table, a moment when the table's named. A lot of table, a moment when the table's named. A few white things where you're eating and there's no table present, but most of the time it's there, okay? Same with the cup. A lot of cup experiences without naming, okay? Every once in a while, there's some naming. There's a yellow one there without the cup. And then interspersed are these episodes where it is named, okay? This is the general pattern for just about every one of these 40 categories, okay? All right. So what do we have? We have visual reference that are pervasive day in and day out. Kind of the data, if you're going to pick a mechanism, kind of looks like, but without labeling, kind of looks like incremental unsupervised learning of object categories, right? Because there's no labeling. They're just pervasively there. You have, whoops. You have name reference co-occurrences. They're sparse, occasional, not every day, not every mealtime. That would suggest one-shot or few-shot learning of object names. But as far as I know, as I said earlier, there is no laboratory evidence that babies under a year of age form durable or lasting memories for pairings of objects and names. And if anybody knows of that data, I would love them to tell me because I've been searching, okay? So how could babies learn these, okay? Well, the traditional complementary learning system suggested that there were 2 ways to form memories. One was slow and incremental. That would fit visual learning. And the other was fast, one shot, and involves the hippocampus. By hypothesis, that might fit the one-shot learning of the names and the reference. Except for infants under 2 years of age, the jury's not totally in, but the evidence suggests that the hippocampus is not fully functional, okay? And that whether it plays any role at all in memory formation is not clear, and whether it could really support one-shot learning like adults do, episodic one-shot learning, is also little evidence, no evidence, in fact. It's anatomically and functionally immature. So this means that for object name learning, there's a serious poverty of the stimulus. sparse experience, really quite infrequent, of name-object co-occurrences. Okay. However, work on cortical learning has advanced markedly, okay, in the last few years. And what we know now is cortical learning without hippocampal involvement can rapidly form memories when they involve a incrementally formed, well-established memory, let's say of the visual objects, and that memory of the visual objects, let's say, is reactivated, then new information that co-occurs with it is rapidly integrated in few shots or one shot. This phenomena of rapid integration of new memories, of new associates, without hippocampal involvement is incredibly well documented in mammals. As far as I know, nobody's looked at it in human babies, okay? But it is now well documented in mammals in general, okay? So what we're suggesting is that we have two time scales in the input: pervasive, repeated, time-separated experiences of unlabeled objects. This leads to incremental learning about those objects, robust memories of what a table is, occasional sparse name-object co-occurrences, but they occur when the visual object is present and you're at a mealtime context. So it's likely reactivating those visual memories and allowing for rapid integration of the name into those visual memories, okay? All right, so there's a lot to be said about this. This needs to be tested and we are working on it, okay? It needs to be formally modeled and we are working on it, okay? So more on that later. But what it suggests, I think, is a really new ideas about how to think about early object name learning. And it also provides a way to break the barrier. There's no well-accepted explanation of how babies break into object name learning. And what I think it suggests is that visual experience with objects, not their names as teaching labels, are literally the foundation, the anchor for that early breaking into object categories and learning object names. Word learning, lexical learning, object name learning may change rapidly, and I'm pretty certain it does by the time a child is 18 months of age. But that early stage, before the first birthday, when you're just finding out that things have names, the things, and vast experience with those things are critical for allowing the name to be learned, associated rapidly, and probably the context and the pervasiveness of the visual objects, my hunches play a big role in allowing you to integrate the experiences you had on Monday when you heard the name and the experience you have next Friday when you hear the name in another sparse event, that context and that commonality is going to be the pointer that allows the already formed memory and new information or co-occurring information to be made. All right, so moving on here to the last point, okay? So this middle part, I've talked about what the natural statistics are. The natural statistics have properties that are general of human behavior in all domains. These are the kind of Zippian things that people talk about. Right skew distributions, highly, at every scale, high context dependency. So you're likely to see the bowl with the spoon, but not the bowl with the telescope. And bursty, because they're context dependent, happening in little time segments that are then time separated, and bursty again and the next time you come across that context. These are like general truths about human behaviors, and brains have probably evolved and developmental processes have probably evolved to incorporate those. And so what I want to talk about here is how the interdependencies, this will be brief, how the interdependencies between the data generated by behavior and the internal learning processes, how they're probably magnified, emphasized, and made more potent and learning more successful by the joint behaviors of two brains with similar intrinsic dynamics in terms of how they interact with the world. So this goes back to thinking again about how durable and expressive associative memories can rapidly form, okay? And I told you about how old knowledge, well-established memories play a role, but other evidence suggests that the key mechanism to which these well-established memories contribute is that you have time-extended reactivation of the formed memory in the context of new associations, that it is a persistence of activation that, without the hippocampus, that forming a cortical memory requires persistent activation that extends in time, okay? Not a millisecond event, okay? And two of the factors that are well documented in the animal studies is that this rapid one-shot learning of novel information and integration into association is more likely in the context of actions. And the reasons they believe that is the case, because when you do one thing, it has an event, and then you do a next thing, and that creates a dynamic of activation over the same content. This is really unlike slides in the lab for teaching babies words, okay? And that the new and old contexts that the new and old information happens in the context of a social interaction. And the arguments that are put forward from the animal work on this is that this is probably because this connects multiple brain regions and again increase the persistence and level of reactivation, which is key for incorporating the new information in. All right. So with Hadar Raz, we have been looking at the dynamic structure of parent and infant play in the toy room. So these are 10 minutes alone in a room with 33 toys on the floor. We have parents, and in this, the data that I'm going to tell you about, 16 12-month-old infants, and the infants are within plus and minus 2 weeks of their first birthday. And the principal measures that we're using here are parent's hand touching the object, child hand touching the object, and parent naming of the object. And what we do is look at the data as in terms of streams of time. So this would be a little sample of the 10 minutes. We sample the data at every 5 seconds, actually, except for naming. Every naming event is sampled. And what you see is, you'll see a little series where the baby plays with one object, let's say indicated by red, and then doesn't play, that's a white, hands are on nothing, then handles the blue object, the yellow object, the orange object. Parents do the same thing. This is joint play. They're often, both of them, touching objects pretty much all the time. And every once in a while, the parent throws in a name for an object. So when you look at which objects a child handles, different children handle different objects. They have different preferences. But they always show this selective function where they play with, in a 10-minute period, they play with a few objects very, very frequently. And all the rest of the objects get handled not so much. Parents do the same thing. This is the ubiquity of these deeply skewed Zipfian distributions in human behavior. Parents across a 10-minute period, they just play with a few objects, the rest very differently. And the correlation between the rank order of a parent and its infant's play is very, very high. The mean R across every child and parent across all the dyads is 0.92, and every child-parent's correlation is individually reliable. Okay. They are really coordinated in the frequency with which they touch the objects. Naming was rare, okay? Just, these are 1-year-olds. There were on average, there were 15 to 30 naming events. That's the range across these 16 parents. That's supposed to be 33. I don't know why it's got 36 in there. Across all 33 toys over the 10-minute period, okay? That's not a lot, okay? Individual objects are named like once, twice, okay? However, there is a real nice temporal structure to this. Okay, whoops. okay? These are the data across a 10-minute period for 4 of the individual participants, okay? The grays are playing with some object down on the long tail of the distribution. The red, blue, and green are playing with the 3 most frequently played with objects, okay? This is just so you can see it, make the structure easier. And what you can see is this kind of, they play with the red object, play with some other stuff, play with the red object, play with some other stuff, play with the red object. There's this real bursty structure to the play, okay? Interleaving, a lot of red object, a lot of green object, then back to the red object, okay? So they're extended in time, they're bursty, some play more, some play less, okay? And these are the parent naming, and parent naming is always close to a burst of activity. Oh, I should have said, these lines refer to the handling by both parent and child. Just because they're correlated, we just consider them equal, okay? So the naming occurs related to these clusters. All right, there we go. So what we're working on now is a model of the quantification of persistent activation. This is like within a mealtime or within a playtime, within a single event. So within this model, momentary activation is a function of handling by the child, by the parent, parent naming, and also the recent history of activity in that session. And what we want to measure is persistence over extended time, taking the idea that periods of persistence, okay, are key to getting novel information integrated, okay? And we're going to define P as the sum of momentary A, okay? So the goal is to quantify persistence, and if we can do that, then we might be able to predict the learning of individual words. We modeled the momentary activation, and then we evaluate the persistence of activation. Our starting point, this is a mathematical model, not an end-to-end computational model. Our starting point is the well-documented and law-like and highly conserved spacing and repetition effects on memory, noted first by Ebbinghaus. And we define memory activation of an object at any temporal stop at each moment in time as a function of the previous repetitions and the time delay between those repetitions. And repetitions, this is Ebbinghaus's law, have bigger effects after longer delays. That's your spacing effect. The effect of time itself is weighted by the history of the elapsed time between events, and the decay rate is a function of the history of the elapsed times. What you can see is that this is your standard sort of dynamic systems equation where activation at each moment is a function of what happened in the previous time step. That previous time step is a function of what happened in the previous time step, okay? All right, here are the predicted momentary activations of memories for objects for individual summed across the individual dyads and for each individual dyad. There's some things I want you to notice, okay? Every one of these children has extremely right skewed, okay, distributions. But notice, like for this child here, even rarely played with objects have long persistence, okay? And that's because of the spacing and the naming. So name object co-occurrence, which is what everybody measures, those statistics may not be as critical as their timing in the input. How the spatial structure of them is organized, okay? So you can see that clearly in the average over here. So way up here, okay, this, pink one here, it's pretty high, number 14, rank order 14, okay? So we're now in the process in collaboration with Chen and going to work on testing the degree to which these, we can actually predict individual learning in children. We're both going to look at old data that's already been collected, and we're also in the process of collecting new data, although it's difficult in given COVID. All right. So what I want to suggest is that the same machinery in parents and infants that make the data is the same machinery that does the learning, and parents and infants jointly create persistent repeated activations. Okay. And these are reactivations of already formed memories or what just happened in the play session. And we propose that this can make learning of name object co-occurrences from the actual poverty and sparse data in the stimulus feasible. And it does it because the learning mechanisms in the organism, those basic 2 time scale aspect of associative learning, highly conserved, available to young babies, match the data. All right, so I began, and now I need to conclude. Learning depends on both the learning machinery and the learning experiences. And what I'm arguing, even if many of my proposals here are not quite correct, is that evolution, development, and the real-time process of behavior all conspire to make the internal learning mechanisms and the statistics of experience interdependent. And that means when we have no idea what the right learning mechanism is, we might really want to look at the structure of the everyday data, because those learning mechanisms are going to be evolved, designed, and shaped to fit those data. Okay. Okay, so that's what I just said, ahead of myself. Now, implications for machine learning. This is one little slide on this just to connect it to the body. But I think that machine learning needs to, stop pulling stuff off the web. It needs to structure, it needs to think about the structure of the learning experiences as they actually happen in the world, and the time dependencies and contextual dependencies that are part of those experiences very, very deeply, and what role they play. I think they need to look at self-generated data. There is probably something very special to the just-in-time nature of what I'm thinking right now and what data comes in the next moment, okay? And that is how, in our everyday world, since even very young babies shift their eyes, and in a very short time, their heads to look at what they're interested in, are shaping their own information. We need to think about multiple timescales for learning. This is one of the problems, I think, with statistical learning. It asks, what's the statistics in the world? But actually, you want to know what's the statistics in the activations in the brain, okay? So you have to understand how they persist or go away or last or get highlighted, right? Because the statistical learning machinery is operating over the statistics in the brain. All right, there are multiple time scales for that, okay? And I think the real-time coupling of the mechanisms that do the learning and the mechanisms that generate behavior, I just said that, I think that has computational implications that may really be powerful. And I think we also need to think about how there's social amplification of the biases in the self-generated data, and that social amplification may play a really critical role in what can happen and in what is learned. Okay. So with that, I want to thank everybody in my lab. I am missing on here one new member, Sarah Benham. It's an old figure. We're getting the new figures made. But I've highlighted Eric C. Miller, Elizabeth Glorkin, and Haydar Raz, who have contributed fundamentally to the work that I am talking about here. I thank all my collaborators, most of whom are smarter than me, and of course, my funding agencies. Okay, thank you.